Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on using R Markdown. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the tools of Markdown, that is, the tools for generating documents, files, websites, and all kinds of interesting stuff from your RStudio interface, from the programming that you're doing in RStudio. I hope this will be useful for all of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work after working through these few points in these slides. I use this constantly for all kinds of really important stuff. R Markdown is really just a way to use a library called knitr, but also a number of other libraries in R, created mainly by this character Yuhi Shi, who I keep talking about, a fantastic programmer who helped us build a lot of tools so that we don't have to write directly in HTML, but can produce the proletariat document that is the HTML document, which should be readable by pretty much anyone with a web browser. You can build really dynamic, beautiful texts with Markdown, or pretty nice slides, as you've seen so far from me. The slides look okay, and you can build them in Markdown so that all of the R code just reads automatically. I don't have to cut and paste and move figures around. It's just showing up in my slides. But moreover, you can produce documents to produce very complex documents, much like LaTeX. In fact, it even understands LaTeX. We'll get into the details maybe at another time on all of these finer points. But there are people, for example, have built my PhD thesis in Markdown. So instead of needing to format Word documents or figure out how to do everything in PDFs, I can export from Markdown directly into the kind of document that I'd like to have. So the first thing you need to do in order to work in Markdown, let me just walk you through, first of all, some main points. And then we'll talk about that. But Markdown essentially is a way to use knitr and pandoc, these two libraries, and execute everything in R code to create these Markdown files, which then can produce PDFs or HTML, as I said. It's extremely simple and does everything with a single render function. That is, it's called render, or also known as knit, a way of making what you've written here into a useful document that you could then maybe use in whichever format you want, but it knits that document together. So here, for example, are the slides for today's presentation. Or rather, here is a Markdown example. We'll go through that. But here, for example, I could just knit, and then it will create, let's try that quickly. If it's working well, it will create a Markdown example. There it is in HTML with embedded hex stickers and some tables and other examples. We'll go through that soon. And to install, in case you didn't have it installed, all you would need to do is just run install packages R Markdown. I've seen that some of you do, and I think the latest installations of RStudio have R Markdown included, so you should. I know that some of you sent me accidentally, instead of sending me R scripts, that's a file that ends with .r, you sent us Markdown scripts, that's a file that ends with RMD, R Markdown. So you should be able to create them right here from this drop-down menu. If not, install packages Markdown and library R Markdown, obviously. Library R Markdown, I've already got it loaded. So it's a simple formatting language, and it makes it easy. It should be making things easy for everyone to access rather than making complex documents of HTML and LaTeX just pure HTML or whichever format produced from a rather simple text. So using R Markdown, there's the knit. From the knit function, I stole the GIF, or I stole the little image so you could see that there. But I've knit this presentation essentially from using form of Markdown. So Markdown, I'm just going to give you an overview. Again, it's a way to incorporate all types of different languages that are designed to produce interfaces for users. So HTML, that's the main one, and I think that's the one that's advocated most by the people who've written these packages, but you can also produce Word documents, you can produce slides, as I've done here, and of course, graphics and PDFs and websites of all kinds. I highly recommend that you use this. It may seem secondary to what's important, but actually it makes my workflow a lot better. You will thank yourself if you do this. Save often. This is a really important point because you may make a small, you may miswrite something somewhere. So save often and make new versions, or use Git. And I've been talking to ZEF about offering a course where I talk about version control in detail, and you can learn more about Git. I know I keep giving plugs for Git. But otherwise save lots of new versions so that you always have something to go back to. So knitr is the main library, and Markdown is what we'll be writing it in. So again, what I talked about in the past days, when you get stuck, you will get stuck. And when you get stuck, you can use the question mark with the function or the package name or the data name. You have this question mark in the R console, of course. And then if you get stuck, really stuck, you can also put your R and the copy of the error message into maybe Google or whichever tool you like to use to search the internet. Almost certainly true, as we've learned, I think, through our group discussions, it's almost certainly the case that someone else has also been confused by this thing that's confusing you. And all you need to do is just check out what they've written. So Stack Overflow is my main research, my main go-to, but I usually start with a general internet search and I end up at Stack Overflow. And I generally end up, because there are really thousands of talented people scanning the web and helping others who have issues. It is really a great community that we have in the R community, but these two are probably the main helpers that I've gone to the most and who've answered the most questions that I had. Not personally answered my questions, but answered other people's questions, and I found those threads on Stack Overflow or otherwise. Hadley Wickham and Yihui Shi. And Yihui put together a really nice, or both of them I think put together a really nice collection of ideas about Markdown right there at markdown.rstudio.com. So just for the very basics, Markdown from RStudio, the way it integrates with RStudio, which is a social entrepreneurship. It's that RStudio is a company, but they're not a company that's trying to make money, but rather a company that's trying to enrich the world and research communities. So look there for authoring basics, and Yihui also gives a lot of code. So if you look on his Blogdown website, yihui.com/markdown, you can see some information about how he does these things. So what we're going to do is just open RStudio, open a Markdown file, use the setup chunk, and remember the table of contents. So we're going to generate both of these, setup chunks and table of contents. So here, actually, if you open just a new Markdown, this is one really nice thing about this. I'm not going to give it a name. I'm just going to open. So all I've done is just open the file. And what it does, the way they've designed this thing is that it actually gives you an example, a working example Markdown file automatically. So all you need to do, there's a bunch of code here. This is called the YAML. This is the part that sets up the code itself. So here you can write whichever name you want. And here you could put whichever date you want. Let's say you want it in the past or in the future. Or you don't even need date. I generally leave that out. And the output in our case will be an HTML document, but it could also be a PDF or other option. I'm going to this is my setup here. And again, as I said, the knitr library is the library that mainly works here, pandoc and knitr. And I'm going to use a function options chunk, and I'm going to set that to echo equals true. That means anything that happens in R will show up in the final document. So this is a chunk of R code. So it starts with these 3 marks. and then parentheses around R, and then I put a title for that chunk. That's also not necessary, but it helps when you're rendering or when you're knitting this document. Essentially, what it does, and I can add a new chunk, might be interesting to know. On my machine, I use Command Alt I, and here I can write anything I want. And 5, okay, let's just do it like that. So now, and then I can just go on direct, just so I can get a 5 here. Now, what I do, let's walk through the rest of it. So when you click the knit button, that's up here, the document will be generated. That includes the content as well as the output. That's this idea here. That's why we've set up echo equals true. But here in this setup, we call it setup. We've said include equals false. That means don't put this chunk of R code, but do include these ones. Summary of cars, the cars data. And you can put plots like plot pressure or any of the ggplot or other plotting options that you have. And now we can just knit. So again, I'm going to just knit this. It's going to want to create an HTML. So it's going to ask me for a title. I'm going to call this temp. And I'm going to save it in the teaching R folder structure. Since it's a test, I just call it test or temp. And here you can see that I've got a untitled document because I haven't added a title here. It's called, we have a title. The title is called untitled. And no name for the author, just name. And it has knit for me, starting with a header. Here, the header is with 2 marks. And actually, I see those in the table of contents. R Markdown is a bit smaller. So the number of hashtags is the depth of the indentation, or the depth of the header. So now they would have high, like heading 1, maybe, and heading 3, depending on the number of hashtags there. And they both show up here in my sidebar, in my TOC, as it were. Yeah, and embedding plots is just automated as they are in my slides. So the plots, depending on participants' data, it changes all the time. And every time I render my slides, that automatically changes based on the new data set every year. And every time you add a new level of data to that thing. So I'm going to walk you through my example. Again, the title, I make up a title. I put myself now as the author. And I've used this little code chunk. So if I use these marks, you see the difference between a quotation and one of these tick marks. The tick mark for me is on the upper left-hand part of my keyboard. And then I put here some R code. So I have to say R, because this is going to be R code. And I use the function sysdate. Sysdate, again, if we use the question mark sysdate to find out what this function does, then we can see it's from base. And actually it says, returns an absolute, or returns an object of class with date, with the current date. And I'm going to produce an HTML document as default here, a default HTML document. In the case of working with Markdown, what's really important is that we try to use relative paths. So that means all the documents that you refer to within this Markdown file should be relative to this Markdown file, not to the RStudio project as with writing an R script, but rather to the Markdown file. So I'm asking now for, again, all of the chunk. This is called a chunk of R code. I'm asking that all the chunks are included. Actually, here I'm asking that all the chunks are included. That means the results, what runs and what comes out of them is shown, but that this particular chunk is not shown. Include equals false. And I'm going to load a library called the ethnobotany R. If you don't yet have it, that means you should install the package. I have already, so I think I have. Because I need of course, quotes here. I'm going to overwrite an existing library. It'll restart my session. And now I can run library as no botany R, everything's fine. So this is the same code we had in our initial document, but now I've created a chunk and I'm giving, it's gonna, again, read the CSV of participants data and call it part dat, actually. And then I'm gonna str part dat. So the participants data has to be located in a location relative to the Markdown file. That means participants data, in this case, I can look in files and I can see that it's here directly. It's often the case that there's a subfolder called data. I think that's a good programming style if you're gonna have lots of data. And then you would just add this to this so that the location of the Markdown refers to a subfolder. And the base plot, kilometers home to ZEF. Let's take that one. And now, we can also embed existing images. So it's not always the case that you need to generate a figure. Maybe there's a picture of a workshop that you've done or something else that's interesting, a picture of a farm plot. You can put that here by embedding a figure using the knitter library and include graphics. Here I'm using, as before, this double colon, so twice a colon, and that will then say that this function comes from this library. So knitter include graphics, and now I'm going to include a file, hex_markdown.png. The file is called hex_markdown, and it's a PNG file, and I'm going to refer to a subfolder. So this is the Markdown example, RMD, and it's stored right here. But the Markdown figure that I want, the hex_markdown.png, is in a subfolder called R Markdown figure. Got a bunch of figures in there. So I need to reach into that subfolder by providing the directory relative to the Markdown file, relative to the RMD. But it's also possible using the library, using these libraries, Markdown library, to put some code here that just finds that file as well. I don't necessarily need to make an R chunk, but I can just tell Markdown to find it directly by putting an exclamation brackets and then R Markdown figure hex Markdown PNG, again the same. I can also use those brackets to put a title, so Markdown hex sticker. You'll see that's where the title shows up. A title will show up underneath, I believe. Now, really critically, and this is, I think, why I generated this example document. When you're writing, and you saw that they told us that once by showing us here knit. When you click the knit button, and when we knit earlier, it's not showing up now, but when you click the knit button, that's in bold here. So these tell the Markdown language that here I want some bold text. So what you can do is, you can do that in several ways. Most people do that with these asterisks. You can do italic with 1 and bold with 2, but it also works with underscores. So if you put 1 underscore or 2 underscores on either side, then that will turn that into bold text or italic text. R code, again, you can either make a code chunk. I do that if I want to write a whole bunch of R script. It'll show up separately from the rest of the text. But you can also write R code right into the text itself. So let's say, for example, you want to say there were X number of, or the standard deviation was this. And you know that, for example, with the participants data, it's going to change every year. Or it's going to change as data changes, or it may change based on which subsets you use and you want to produce multiple documents. So you can just put there participants data, sum or mean or standard deviation of whichever variable you want, and that will show up. Here again are the headers, 1, 2, and 3. So this is the, of course, big and bold, a bit smaller and more indented, etc., depending on the format you use. And here we can make a list. So this is an unordered list, item 1, item 2, and these are just going to be bulleted, right? It doesn't matter to you the order. There's no meaning to the order, so you just want bulleted lists. This is how you do that with an asterisk and a plus sign. And if you want an ordered list, then you're going to use, and it doesn't matter if you say here 1, 3, 5 or 1, 1, 1. It's going to show up as 1, 2, and 3. And then these are going to be 3A and 3B because you started this numbered list. It knows that it's ordered and it will continue the order. That's quite useful when you're making long lists, or you might shift things around and then you have to renumber them, 10 items with 10 A, B, C. It's going to get really confusing, but this will take care of that for you. And all the R code will be both evaluated and printed. So that means when I run summary on these things, then the code will be run. We'll see that code in the text, and it will also produce the result below this code chunk. Here's an example of the inline R code. So there were so many rows. I can count the number of rows in the cars data, and it tells me how many cars were studied. We can use a plain web address or add a link to a phrase. So I can just put a plain web address and that'll be live in the document, or I can put a linked phrase, like click here, and this will automatically be linked to that phrase. Instead of showing the website, I'll just see a hyperlinked phrase in the text. I can use block quotes by using these formats here. We'll see how that looks in a bit, but this is a good way to get block quotes if you want to say something within the text. And these plain code blocks, so you could just put plain text and it will just be fixed widths, but nothing will be evaluated when this runs. It'll just show up as it is. This text within these chunks will just show up as it's pre-formatted, so it'll look like an R chunk or something else and be within a chunk, a little gray box probably in this format. And we can also refer to R functions within the text using that same R as we did here, and R and row cars. We can refer to R functions in this way. That's not critical, but it does keep the style consistent. What's really useful, I found, is that we can add LaTeX equations. So we can run with LaTeX and tell it we want to see an equation, and we can display equations in this way with also in LaTeX style. If you're familiar with LaTeX, that'll be probably the most comfortable. I'm learning LaTeX through mostly through Markdown, which has been an interesting experience. So if you want to have a horizontal rule page break, then you use 3 or more asterisks or dashes. You'll notice in my R presentations, if you've downloaded any of this, that these 3 marks split the slide in half. And in our case, 3 or more of these will split the page, put a line across the page. You can write your own tables. I recommend that only for very simple tables, and generally rather generate tables or import them. Let's knit and see what happens. I don't remember what I wrote here. Subscript in blue, it's rhyming. Roses are red, subscript in blue. So that's a way to make subscript, sub, in, and then I have to write some HTML here, unfortunately, but I can get a color blue with some HTML and put it in subscript here using the sub arguments in HTML. And again, with HTML, I can underline, I can superscript and strike through. Roses are red, subscript in blue, underline, superscript, and strike through. Those are all possible. This is a very small portion of the possibilities of the ways that you can write things in Markdown. It's much more versatile, I find, than LaTeX, and requires quite a bit less skill in these kinds of languages, and I think there's a bit less of a risk of messing something up so that your whole document becomes a mess. Let's go down through again and see what happens. So that ran this code, and it gave us the structure of the code of that particular data set. So we're seeing the part data, read CSV, and now we're getting the structure of participants data, part data. We've plotted the kilometers from home to ZEF in base R. Not beautiful. I do recommend upgrading to a different plotting style, but here you can see, for example, the echo equals false parameter, plot participants data home to ZEF, echo. False. Now that will be true, what they said. Now the plot is there, and echo equals false means that the code chunk stopped the R code from showing, so we can't see how the plot was generated. That's probably what you'll want when you're doing really long ggplot functions. You won't want to see all of that ggplot data appear, unless what you're trying to communicate is how to make the plot itself. Here again, I import using the knitr include graphics function. And here it is in that title I made. Here it is in other ways, which is the direct markdown, and the title shows up underneath or that text that I generated shows up underneath that sticker. Now, here are all those header options that I talked about. The ordered lists, again, you just get an unordered list without the numbers, shows up as bullets, and ordered lists show up 1, 2, 3, and then 3A, 3B, also as bulleted subpoints. Good to know. Your R code will be evaluated and printed, as we said. So you'll get, not only will it show the code chunk in this box, but also show the results of that code chunk. And here you remember that we said the inline R code, we said there were 50 cars. We didn't say 50, we said there were cars, n-row cars. Where's that one? N-row cars studied. Yeah, so that's on line 95, n-row cars studied. But here it shows up as 50 because it counts n-row and it gives the result of that R chunk. So you can link the phrase, as I said, or just use the HTTP, the straight up HTML, either way, so the straight up web address or linking the web address to text. This is the direct text block text, and here it is in plain code chunks, as you've seen in the past, just like here. When you call an R function, it looks like that, so it just standardizes the style throughout the code. If you do call an R function, it is standard to use the same formatting for that R function as you do for R code in the rest of the HTML. Here again for equations, tables, as I said, fine if they're very simple, but generally I would tend to read a table in from a CSV or otherwise generated in R. Manual line breaks, what I meant to say there is that if you have to put 2 or more spaces between lines, so manual line breaks. Maybe I'll put a note here like otherwise. That'll help in the future. So now if I knit, otherwise it all goes on the same line. And there you go, otherwise it all goes on the same line. And we can also go to, because what they recommend when they generate this automatic file, they recommend going to rstudio.com. And that'll open a file for us, and then we can get some information directly from the makers on what they think is great about this tool. I recommend you visit this website, but I'll walk you through quickly what I think is great here. They have these getting started, and they have these galleries, fantastic, really good formats. The galleries give you all kinds of examples of what styles people come up with. This helped me generating initially the style for my PhD report, the final thesis that I handed in. I used Miller's work as a little bit of a stepping stone on the way to getting that all written in Markdown. You can build widgets, you can build all kinds of HTML, and actually a lot of the books that we read now in R are generated in Markdown related tools like Bookdown, Blogdown. These are all really great. So if you click here on the Getting Started with Markdown, just on their website, rstudio.com, then they give you some really good tips on how to use this as an authoring framework. A lot of people generate their papers directly in Markdown because it is so easy, isn't it? I mean, you get feedback from an author and you co-author and you want to change things in the document. It's a little bit more standardized. Your co-authors may not be able to read Markdown. That's unfortunately going to always be the case unless you're in a very special situation, but you can export it as a Word document and refeed their feedback into your Markdown to generate the file. Again, it adds an extra step, but it can ease the load of processing on figures, code, and this kind of stuff. Good. There's a cheat sheet as before. There are always cheat sheets. And I recommend having those handy. As I said, I print these out and keep them on the wall in my office. It's decoration, but it's also really useful to have this thing here because I always have questions. I don't memorize the name of every function and how it works. I learn as I go, and I remember as I do lots of trial and error. I'm going to give you the file for my presentation in case I've mostly done this as a kind of cheap parlor trick to show you what's possible and to show the versatility of usability of the R Studio and R programming language. But I will also share this with you so that you can play around with that. And what I'm asking now for the afternoon is that you do go ahead and generate this Markdown file. I want you to do that. Don't forget the setup chunk. You can use that however you want to. And remember to use the table of contents. That is to say, remember to mark your generated HTML file or other style of file. Make sure you mark that so that it has a clear table of contents. And I wish you a lot of luck. And please do not hesitate to get in touch with me and with your colleagues if you have some issues or if you learn something interesting about this process.